Mikko, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
We've been having a fun time chatting before we're recording, and I think we've eaten up most of our time doing that. Not really, but we'll jump into it. Can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So, my name is Mikko. I live in Helsinki, which is in Finland, which is in Europe. I'm a old school hacker. I started programming as a teenager, sold my first programs when I was 17 years old, reverse engineered my first malware in 1991 when I was 21 years old. And for the last 32 years, I've been tracking online attackers, figuring out where the organized crime gangs come from, and tracking down governmental attackers, especially Russia, since I live 100 miles from the Russian border.
Yeah, that's got to be. We'll get to that one. That was going to be an interesting story. Ukraine versus Russia on the cyber
Mhm.
front. So what got you interested in computers?
Well, it was my mom, of all possible choices. My dear late mother, Rauha, got into computers in the 1960s. And
Oh
in
wow.
1960s, very few people were working with computers, but she went to work for the Finnish State Computing Center in Helsinki, Finland in 1967, I believe. She retired from there after 40 years of work, which means throughout my teenage years and all that defining years of my time, mom would come home carrying punch cards and punch tape and things like that. Obviously, me and my two brothers all ended up working with computers. And I especially remember in 1986, when I was 16, when my mother sat me down on the kitchen table and told me that, Mikko, you should go and study telecommunications. Telecommunications is the future. And that's a pretty good call in 1986, because this was before mobile phones, before common internet, before any of that. And I'm glad I had a chance to thank my mom later on that, you know what, mom, that was a really good call.
Yeah, I remember my first computer was a Commodore VIC-20 with a tape cassette, and at some point, maybe it was when we had a Commodore 64, we got an amazing 300 baud modem that you had the suction cups that you would click onto your handset phone.
Oh, mine. Oh, mine. The first computer I programmed anything on was at the school, and that was a Nokia computer. Nokia used to make computers. These were CPM machines. But at home, the first computer was a Commodore 64. Now, every time I speak to people who used to have a VIC-20, I always give them credit because most people don't know this. VIC-20 and Commodore 64 have basically the same CPU, but VIC-20 is faster. It has a
Hmm.
higher megahertz rate than Commodore 64. Yes, it might have less colors and less pixels, but it had a faster CPU. So good for you. There you go.
It's a very far cry from what goes on today when uh, our pens have computers in them, our watches have computers in
Oh,
them,
yeah.
and our
I
water
would not
bottles
have
have
believed
computers in
any
them.
of that. If someone would have told me back then when I was programming my Commodore 64 in assembly language in 1980s that eventually every home is going to have a computer, I wouldn't have believed that. Of course, much less would I have believed that every pocket would have
Yeah.
a computer.
Well, and these days, I mean, you talk about it in your books. It's like we were talking beforehand. We got smart doorbells now. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
no one would have thought of, I'm going to have a smart doorbell.
They make a lot of sense. I understand perfectly well why people have smart doorbells or smart fridges. I don't have a smart fridge myself, but I've seen people doing grocery shopping and they can't remember what's in the fridge. So they just take out their phone and they look inside the fridge. And that makes a lot of sense to me. The problem really is that nobody configures these correctly. And in the marketplace, the cheapest product wins. And
Yeah.
that basically means that for the vendors building these appliances, there's no incentive to make them secure. If you invest money as a vendor to make your smart fridge more secure than the competitors, the only end result is that your product is more expensive. When people go shopping for fridges or washing machines, they ask questions about the color of the thing or the
Yeah.
how big is it. Nobody asks questions about security. That's really the problem we have with IoT security.
Yeah, no one plans on updating the firmware on their refrigerator.
That's right. So it's in many ways it's sort of like a market failure, and the way we typically try to fix market failures is with regulation, with rules and regulation. And I'm not really a fan of regulation, but if we're going to regulate something, this might be the place to do it. Pass some sort of regulation which would make vendors shipping vulnerable IoT devices um, make them liable for the damages they create. It's actually quite weird if you buy a washing machine and it has it catches fire in the middle of the night and burns your house down. The vendor is liable for the damages. But if the very same washing machine has weak authentication or remote authentication bug and someone gains access to your home network and you wake up with every laptop in your home having ransomware on it, suddenly they are not liable. And maybe that's the thing we should change.
Yeah, and like you said, I hate seeing those things have to happen through government regulation. It's usually a sledgehammer when it needs to be a little bit more delicate and more
Mhm.
refined.
Yeah. Well, then again, you're speaking to someone from the EU, and as it's very well known, EU in many ways can't innovate, so we regulate.
Yeah. I don't think that's unique to the EU. Everywhere that most places it seems to be that the government regulations. I'm trying to choose my words carefully here. That government regulations indicate that those who wrote the regulations don't quite understand what they're trying to regulate, and so they're overly broad or overly specific and don't really address the problem.
Well, during the spring, I was in Italy, and I spent a week there, and I couldn't access ChatGPT during the week because ChatGPT is blocked in
Hmm.
Italy. Don't ask me why. It has something to do with copyright or whatever. And I'm sure the ones losing the most out of these kind of things are the Italians themselves. So, yeah, regulation isn't easy, and I think it typically fails.
Yeah. So let's get back to smart devices. So if we're generally buying, if consumers are generally buying the cheapest devices, they're going to be more prone to having security issues, less prone to having firmware updates. How, as consumers, do we manage our smart devices?
In fact, surprisingly, many of the hackable devices online wouldn't be hackable if the consumers would simply read the manual. I mean, there's plenty of information coming with these products explaining how to change the default password, how to configure it right, how to prevent outsiders from accessing your control panel, how to segment your home network to keep your computers in one segment and your IoT devices in another segment. The problem is nobody reads the manual. So it's not completely the fault of the vendors. The consumers have some responsibility here as well, but we can't really expect consumers to read the manual. My favorite example about this is that, well, you will remember VHS or VCR recorders from the
Yeah.
1980s. Every living room had one right below the huge TV set. And every time you went to your friend's house, the VCR was blinking 0000.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's blinking is that the time hasn't been set. And the manual, of course, explains how to set the time. We simply no one ever did that, did they? And if you did it, then the next power cut took it away and no one repeated it. People didn't know how to maintain or configure their devices. And it's the same problem we have with IoT. Nobody reads the manual.
So what are the most common failure points for the consumer then? Is it default passwords? I know some router manufacturers have gotten maybe I won't call it smart, but they've each one comes out the door with a unique password on a sticker on the device
Mm-hmm.
versus admin or password.
Mm-hmm. The sticker on device, I actually like that. Of course, it's very weak if someone gains physical access to your router, but that completely changes the threat scenario. Now the attacker has to be in your home. Most attackers are not in your home. I don't even mind if people put passwords in their wallet.
Yeah.
Sure, it's better to use a password manager. But if you have a password written on a piece of paper in your wallet, somebody has to physically gain access to your wallet, which is not most of the attackers online. If you have a weak password, the whole world can try it.
Yeah.
So yeah, authentication is the most common problem. And we see this with these massively common IoT worms, most of which are one way or another belonging to the Mirai family, which we found already 6-7 years ago. Mirai is Japanese. It means the future. And this really is the future of malware. Fun fact, when we look at the internet traffic over the whole IPv4 address space and look at malicious traffic in particular, of course, it used to be mostly Windows malware, but it isn't anymore. And this is surprising. Most malware traffic we see today is Linux malware traffic. There's more traffic online coming from Linux-based malware than from Windows-based malware. And the reason why this changed is IoT malware. There's plenty of these IoT devices are running on Linux, and there's plenty of these Mirai-related malware out there, and they infect devices by trying known weak password username combinations.
Are they trying to get access to, are the threat actors trying to get access to the devices, to get access to the internal network, or to use them for denial of service attacks or launching attacks on other external to the home user's network?
Botnets are the default use for infected IoT devices. And it's almost surprising because people think there's no computing power to steal from these devices. Actually, there's surprisingly much to steal. For example, we regularly see security cameras taken over by IoT botnets. Connected security cameras are actually pretty powerful. They have to have wide bandwidth so they can stream full HD or 4K video stream, and they have to have pretty impressive computing capability so they can encode 4K streams in real time. If you use that to launch denial of service attacks, you end up with really powerful denial of service attacks, especially when you have, let's say, 5,000 or 20,000 of these devices at the same time. We also see them being used for cryptocurrency mining. Again, you would think there's not much power in there, but there's cryptocurrencies which have been designed so that you don't need dedicated devices or GPUs to mine them. And then, of course, they can also be used as ways of gaining access to further network, although most of those kind of attacks are then in corporate networks, not in home networks. So think the coffee machine at the office being infiltrated and then used to gain access to the internal network and then leverage that for lateral movement further in the network.
I mean, the denial of service attacks these days are getting absolutely terrifyingly massive, aren't they? I mean, so many people now have, gigabit fiber into the home that if you've got a compromised device or two on your network, that can times 1 million devices.
Yep.
It's a staggering amount of bandwidth.
And it's not going to go away. Right now, as we are recording this, NATO is having its summit in Lithuania, not too far away from Finland. And those networks in Lithuania have been under a massive amount of denial of service attacks for the last days, organized by Russian patriotic hacker groups. I was just checking their targets, which they announce on Telegram because they are crowdsourcing these attacks. And they were hitting the conference center website where the NATO summit is going on right now. They're hitting public infrastructure like transportation. They are hitting NATO websites. So yeah, if you have enough bandwidth, you can put down a lot of packets. And even if you have denial of service filtering, it's still going to hurt you and it's going to cost you.
Yeah. The massive amounts of bandwidth cost money somewhere along the line. Someone has to pay for it somewhere.
Yeah, but then again, it is transient. I mean, it's the way I always explain it to layman is that it's a traffic jam, because that's what they understand. Yeah. Traffic jams are a huge problem, but once the traffic jam clears, there's no permanent damage. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken. It just slows things down.
It's an inconvenience as opposed to damage.
That's right. Then again, if the inconvenience means that you can't get a doctor appointment because the reservation system is down, that's a real world problem.
Yeah. Traffic jams do have life and death consequences at some scale and at some point.
Sure.
Do you see much in your research much attack on medical equipment these days?
Yep, they are as easily hackable as anything else. You would think that the vendors would make sure that medical devices are better protected than, a fridge or a washing
Yeah.
machine. In practice, they're not. The typical excuse is that they are supposed to be put into separate disconnected networks or separate segments, or they are supposed to be kept offline. And that's something which is really easy to say and surprisingly hard to do in the real world. And the root cause why it's hard to do in the real world is that TCP/IP routes. That's the strength of the protocol. That's why we've been using the same protocol for 50 years.
Yeah.
It's been designed from the very beginning that if the packet can't get from point A to point B, it will find a new route. And if that doesn't work, it will find a new route. It will keep trying until it finds a route. It might go around the world, but if that's the only way to get to the destination, it will go around the world. And this means when you initially set up a network which is secured and disconnected, over time, surprising things happen. Someone reconfigures the network. Someone adds or connects two networks together. Someone adds a bridge. Someone adds a remote access point. Someone installs a modem so they can work remotely. The company buys another company and the networks are merged. And then after 2-3 years, you're surprised to find that the things which were supposed to be offline are no longer offline.
Yeah, that can be quite startling when your pacemaker is accessible by someone on the internet.
Mm-hmm. We've had this happen many times. We scan the networks of different countries, for example, and just to see what's in there. And when we find something really concerning, sometimes it's a honeypot. That's something which explains some of the worst things we find. But some of them actually are real.
For people who don't know, what is a honeypot?
Honeypot is a bait system which looks like a really vulnerable, really important system, but it's only there to get the attackers to attack it. And in reality, it's not the system it claims to be at all. It's a trap. But so, for example, we find like payment terminals online with default passwords, and we look at them. We contact the vendor, and they tell us that it's fine. It's a honeypot. You don't have to worry about it. But sometimes when we call, for example, factories and tell them, hey, your control interfaces are exposed to the internet and there's no password, you end up with these really weird, absurd phone discussions where the factory tells you that no, you're wrong, Mikko, you're wrong. Our control interfaces are not on the public internet. They are in a private network. They cannot be accessed from the internet. And then I tell them that, you know what, believe what you want. I'm looking at your interface right now, and I'm in Helsinki, Finland, and they don't believe me. And then I suggest that, okay, why don't I go and start clicking on these buttons in your interface? And then they're like, okay, please don't click on the buttons.
Please don't break our hardware, shut down our factory. This could cost us real money. So speaking of all of this hacking, have you been a victim of a hacking incident yourself?
Yep, I have. I've had my credit card number stolen twice over the years. Then again, I don't know exactly how it was stolen. I'm guessing it was stolen in these breaches. Maybe Global Payments breach was the biggest one we ever saw, where more than 10 million credit card numbers were taken in one go. But nevertheless, the end result was that someone in Italy was buying first-class tickets on my credit card. And I've been infected. My computers have been infected as well. I work with malware. I've been doing reverse engineering for decades. Sometimes you misclick. I've had it happen to myself. And the end result is that, the thing you're trying to analyze executes and gets out of control. Of course, we do this in disconnected systems, in virtual machines, so they're not going to go and infect outsiders, but it's still a huge mess when you have to roll back everything and double check, triple check that nothing went down. But I completely understand why people get infected or why people get fooled. When you're tired, when you're anxious, when you're in a hurry, we all make mistakes. I make mistakes.
Yeah, and that's good for people to know that even experts make mistakes, and hopefully you're putting things in place to address the mistake when it happens. So what are some of the things that people can do as you know, we talk a lot about prevention, but assuming that you have been compromised, what are some things that you should do before you're compromised, and things that you should do after you've been compromised?
Well, before you get compromised, the number one rule is backups. You have to have a recovery mechanism one way or another. Nowadays, well, it depends if we're speaking about home users or corporate users, but especially for home users, these cloud backups have changed things a lot, especially on Apple's side. Being able to take things into iCloud, which happens pretty much automatically, is really, really a great way to make sure you have a backup which is hard to corrupt for the outsider. Even if the current version of the iCloud backup is corrupted, Apple can roll back to a previous version, and there's no easy way for an attacker to corrupt that. And that's a great benefit. But then if things have already happened, my number one tip is that when you are in a crisis situation, when you believe you've been hacked, or when you are getting scammed, you get a phone call, you get an email about something critical, take a break, step out of the room, walk around the block, think it through, like just clear your head for a second and reconsider what's happening. What's the real information? What's really happening? Am I being scammed? Am I being fooled? Or I made a mistake. My machine is infected. Instead of drastically trying to undo everything, step away from the keyboard and think for a moment before you act. Think about who you should be calling for help. Think about what you should be doing next instead of doing it.
Yeah, that taking a pause is a good is a good practical when things start getting out of control.
And as always, it's much easier to say than do.
Yes. In the moment when the adrenaline is flowing, when your emotions are high, stopping and walking away is really, really hard to do.
And that's exactly when you should do it.
We almost need a circuit breaker when our emotions get too high. It just clicks and nope, I got to take a break.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about I don't know if you call it cyber warfare, but let's talk about like what's going on between Russia and Ukraine on the cyber front.
Sure. So just as a backgrounder, Finland has 900 miles of border with Russia. Both my grandfathers fought the Russians in the Second World War. Finland has a very long history with a very problematic neighbor, the biggest country in the world. And since I've been working for Finnish cybersecurity companies all my life, from here, of course, we pay close attention to what's happening in Russia, not just Russian cybercrime gangs, but also Russian government. There's been plenty of attacks by the government, espionage attacks over the last 15 years that we've been investigating. But now, when things are becoming much more concrete, what we're seeing is that countries like Russia, they're not only doing espionage, they're also doing sabotage with cyber tools. And when you do sabotage during wartime, then we don't call it sabotage, then it's war. These could be called cyber weapons, and this should be called cyber war. If you look at what's happening right now between Russia and Ukraine, they are fighting a war in 5 different domains at the same time: on land, on sea, in air, in space, and in cyberspace. And the interesting thing when you think about these domains where we fight our wars today is that the expansion of these domains from the original domain, which was only land war 1,000 years ago, the only wars we had were land wars. The extensions to these new domains have always been shaped by technology, and it's going to continue. Whatever the next domain for war will be shaped by technology. And we don't know what it's going to be, but what we do know is that it's going to sound like science fiction today, exactly like cyber war would have sounded like science fiction 30 years ago.
So what are the targets that both countries are going after, and how do they expect it to? What's the kind of the intent behind it to further the physical war?
There's both spying and espionage happening, which is crucial. Today, technology enables you to track troop movements or grouping of the troops in a completely different way than it used to be because if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war right now, in many ways, it resembles the war we had 80 years ago in Europe. Like you have tanks and you have guys in ditches with assault rifles. That's like we did in 1943 or wherever. The difference is that now you can send out drones and satellites to look what's really happening. You can triangulate RF radio. You can track people's mobile phones, which means you get much more information, the kind of information that during the Second World War, the only way to get that information was to send someone over there to see it with their own eyes. That's the only way you would really be able to figure out what was happening. And that's the real difference. So technology is shaping war in many ways, but the real game changer are cyber attacks themselves. Russia has been targeting Ukraine with cyber attacks for the last 7 years, both for gaining access to their systems to get information, but also destruction. GRU, the Russian military intelligence, is best known for doing these destructive attacks, including attacks like NotPetya from 6 years ago, or the attacks we've seen over the last 18 months, including the 27th of February 2022 attacks against Ukrainian border control systems. When the war broke out again in February last year, there were these massive queues of women and children trying to flee Ukraine to the safety of Poland, and they couldn't get out of the country. There were like 24, 48-hour queues on the borders, which were caused by the fact that Russian cyber attacks had wiped the computers of Ukrainian border control. So the borders were open, but the computers were down, and everything had to be done by pen and paper. That's what normal modern cyber war looks like.
Taking out kind of critical infrastructure and whatnot. Has there been much attacks on kind of power, water, utility platforms?
There's been attacks on electricity multiple times, but the last successful time Russians were able to cut power in Ukraine was almost 3 years ago. And it's not for a lack of trying. They've tried over and over again, but now lately they've been failing. And the reason why they are failing is very simple. Ukraine has become the best country in Europe to defend their networks against Russian governmental attacks. They're better than us here in Finland or in Germany or in UK or in France. And the reason is very simple. They've been targeted with these governmental attacks from Russia for 7 or 8 years now. And when you do something over and over and over again, you become an expert in whatever you're doing. That's what they've done. In Finland, we have a large reserve. We're a country of 5.5 million people, but we have 1 million men reserve, including me. And whenever I go back to military refreshers, they don't give me a gun. They give me a keyboard because that's what I'm best at. But when we do our rehearsals, it's make-believe. We're playing like games. We are figuring out that if the Russians would do this, what would we do then? And that's completely different to what Ukrainians are doing. They're fighting a very real war, and they've been defending against very real attacks for many years. And that's what gives them the expertise. And of course, they have very powerful help from the West, helping them defend against these attacks from Russia.
Is some of it just they've had time to address kind of the things that we were talking about earlier? Well, we thought with this network was segregated, but there is someone put a modem in over here, someone connected these networks together over there, that they just have the practical experience of having to defend for so many years that they just kind of are more aware of the digital landscape, so to speak.
It's a big country. They have great technical expertise. They have great universities. They have a large infrastructure. And the biggest challenge really they've had is the amount of legacy systems. If you look at their GDP, it's not a very wealthy country compared to most of Europe. And that really translates fairly directly to the fact that there's a lot of old systems running old operating systems on them. And as you know, it's almost impossible to try to patch and defend outdated systems and legacy systems. And that's the thing that they've been able to improve heavily over the last 18 months or so. They've also heavily embraced cloud ever since the invasion started in February 2022. They moved very quickly their governmental systems to cloud environments as Russian troops started rolling over the border.
And then I imagine, I kind of think that if you have soldiers with cell phones in their pockets, that becomes a whole new kind of way to try to figure out what's going on. That now you're trying to compromise phones belonging to soldiers to figure out where they are, using
Mhm.
cell phone systems to find out where devices are, and then trying to determine are these domestic or these foreign devices, and use that as intel as well.
Yeah, yeah. We are carrying supercomputers in our pockets with all the benefits and with all the problems that comes with the fact.
So, what do you think? You were talking earlier about the next domain for war. What do you think the next domain is?
I don't know, but I can make a guess. I already said that it's going to sound like science fiction. So, what would be enough science fiction like? I don't know. Maybe, how about this? The sixth domain for war will be nano warfare, where the armies would be dispersing airborne aerosol over the battlefield, which would contain tiny nanobots, which would enter the bloodstream of enemy soldiers, find their way to their brains to change their thoughts. Does that sound like science fiction? Yes, it does. Just like cyber war
Yeah,
sounded like science fiction 30 years ago.
yeah. Nanobots that just disable all the equipment.
Yeah, something like that. Or maybe it's going to be something on AI, which of course AI is living the hottest AI summer in history
Yes.
right now.
So let's wrap up with AI. What are your thoughts, concerns, uh, uh, joys about AI?
We started building machine learning systems for our cybersecurity products in 2005. That's 18 years ago. That's a really long time ago. And all that time, we've been waiting for our enemies to catch up, to start to use the same technologies. And we're still mostly waiting. We've seen the odd deep fake. We've seen the first Python malware, which uses GPT to rewrite its code. But what really is still missing, which could happen any day, is complete automation of malware campaigns.
Hmm.
And this is going to be it's going to be interesting when it happens, because right now there's very few areas where the defenders are winning, and the attackers are losing. But when you think about the automation of detection technologies, we actually do have the upper hand because we are much, much faster than the enemy.
Hmm.
Security companies like WithSecure, where I work, or EDR products all around the world, are automated as much as possible. Whenever there's a new possible attack, it gets dropped into a honeypot. The samples are extracted, they're thrown into virtual systems, they're executed and analyzed. If they turn out to be malicious, detection is automatically built, tested, and deployed. This happens in minutes. The attackers are still working manually.
Hmm.
They are writing a new ransomware, then they are crafting malicious emails, registering domain names, spamming out the emails. And then when they realize that the domain is blacklisted, they go and register a different domain. When they notice that the emails are thrown into spam, they rewrite the
Yeah.
email. When they realize that the binary is detected, they recompile it manually at human speed. And the defenders work at machine speed. So we do have the upper hand for now. When the attackers change, when they shift into full automation, which they could do today, then it's going to be a machine against a machine. And we don't really know who's going to win. The only thing we do know is that the only thing which can defend you from a bad AI is a good AI.
Yeah, that becomes maybe that's the next domain for war is AI versus AI.
Yeah, sounds like a new movie
Or an old movie, I guess, depending
or
on
an
how you
old
look
movie.
at
Yes, yes,
it.
very true.
There've been a few of them out there. So as we wrap up here, if people want to find more about you and what you do and the books you've written, where can they go?
Sure. They should go to my website. So my name is Mikko and my website is mikko.com. That's mikko.com. And on the website, there's a section for publications, including my newest book published by Wiley in August 2022 called If It's Smart, It's Vulnerable. Now available in 4 different languages. And we're actually right now working on Ukrainian translation as well. So I'm really happy that it's been received well and it's a bestseller. So I'm really happy about the success of the book.
That's awesome, and I assume it's available everywhere that you can download, listen, and physically ship books from.
It's on Amazon as a hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Audiobook is great. I really love this, the guy who read the book. I didn't read it myself.
Oh, that's too bad.
No, my publisher actually asked me to Mikko, why don't you just read one chapter from the book to your recorder and send it over, and we'll consider if you should read it yourself. And I did my best reading impression. I sent it over, and they were so nice. They replied back to me that, Mikko, this is great. We love the way you sound. Your English is excellent. Your pronunciation is top notch, but really, no one's going to listen to 8 hours of this.
Oh, that's too bad. Are you available? Not available, but can people find you on social media, or have you abandoned social media or switched to Threads?
I can't switch to Threads. It's not available in the EU. I haven't even seen it. It's actually surprisingly hard to get in EU. Of course, I can use a VPN to go to USA, but you would have to have the US version of the App Store to be able to download it. And it's a bit tricky because then you have to throw away all of your existing applications. So I haven't even seen it, which means I'm still on Twitter. I've been on Twitter for 13 years. I have a big following there. So it's kind of sad to let it go, but it seems to be dying.
Well, and is it just Mikko?
It's just Mikko.
See, you thought about these things many years ago before the rest of us
Personal
thought
branding,
about
Chris. Personal branding.
Always a challenge for people. Thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Thank you for having me.